Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Anyone that knows me knows I have an affinity for redheads. I grew up with redheaded cousins, my dad and my sister are strawberry blondes, and of course my middle daughter is a gorgeous redhead. She has a color of hair that people pay master colorists a lot of money to give them. It's like those gorgeous golden retrievers that have that fabulous reddish coat. Less than 2% of the world population has red hair. It's not just rare, it's incredibly rare. Red hair is a result of a mutated gene, the gene labeled MC1R. If both parents carry that gene, there is a 25% chance they will have a redheaded child. With redheads on my side of the family and my ex having a redheaded sister, we knew there was a likelihood we'd get a redhead, and we did. There are a lot of other interesting facts about redheads. They perceive pain differently than other people do. Generally, they have a higher pain tolerance than most people, but certain kinds of pain can be more intense for them. And yes, I can confirm, redheads tend to have a temper. They also have a lower tolerance for things that bother them. My daughter has misophonia. The sound of chewing drives her absolutely crazy. Redheads are also at a higher risk for cancer than most of us. In some cultures, red hair used to be seen as a bad thing, and redheaded children were mistreated. But now they're just seen as special. In fact, advertisers prefer to use redheads in commercials because the perception of them is that they're unique and individualist and also very, very beautiful. Someone else thought redheads were special and decided to target them, not to put them in commercials, but to kill them. And when the killing began, it lasted for 2 decades. This is the story of the series of murders known collectively as the Redhead Murders. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's get into it. February 13th, 1983. An elderly couple is driving down a rural road in Wetzel County, West Virginia. On the side of the road, they see what they believe to be a mannequin dumped in the snowy grass. But something doesn't feel quite right, and so they decide to stop. As they get closer, they realize that it is not, in fact, a mannequin, but the naked body of a deceased white woman there frozen on the side of the highway. They flag down a passing driver who gets to a telephone and calls the police. Authorities cordon off the dump site and the body is removed. It is evident from the very start that the body has recently been placed there in the snow, that location is not where the woman was killed. There was snow on the ground and under the body, but not on the body. There were also visible footprints and tire tracks in the snow leading away from the body. This is how they knew their victim had been killed elsewhere and then dumped on the roadside. The coroner estimated that the woman had been dead for about 2 days, and it appeared she had been strangled or suffocated, but a cause of death was never fully determined. There were no signs of sexual assault on the body. They estimated her age between 35 and 45 years old. She was well nourished, she was healthy, and she had beautiful auburn hair. For months, authorities try and identify the woman, but no one comes forward to report her as missing, and she becomes known simply as the Wetzel County Jane Doe. Police aren't sure what kind of a murder they've got on their hands. Is this a domestic situation? Is this a drug user that made the wrong people angry? They had very little to go on, and then it happened again. On September 16, 1984, on Interstate 40 near West Memphis, Arkansas, the body of a young woman is found, again on the side of the road, and again she is almost naked. She does have a sweater on. This time it is apparent that the woman has been strangled. She has pretty strawberry blonde hair, but unfortunately no identification. Again, the police try and determine who the woman is, but months go by, and like before, no one comes forward to report a missing female in the area. The police continue to publicize the murder and ask the public for help. And finally, 9 months after the discovery of the body, a couple living in Florida contacts the police and tells them that the woman on the news used to live with them. Her name is Lisa Nichols. Lisa had had a falling out with her family and wasn't speaking to them, and that is most likely why no one reported her missing. Lisa was 28 years old at the time of her murder, and people had reported seeing her near a truck stop before she was killed. Police then began to believe she had been working at that truck stop as a sex worker, and she had met with someone who ended her life. At that point in time, the police had no reason to believe the two murders were linked. The women were found not only in different counties, but in different states. They had little to go on and assumed, as most would, that these were just two unfortunate women who had met with foul play. They had no way of knowing that these two would become just the first of many red-headed women that would continue to be found for years to come. New Year's Day, 1985. Our story now takes us to I-17 that runs near Jellicoe, Tennessee. It's not clear if it was the odor or the sight that attracted motorists, but a body was discovered in an advanced state of decomposition, which was somewhat strange because the coroner determined the woman had only been killed 72 hours prior to being found. I would like some clarification on how, especially in the dead of winter, a body can reach an advanced state of decomposition in only 72 hours. So I looked for more information on this and I didn't come up with anything. So as always, if any of you have information on that, I would love to hear it. These older cases are not always well documented. The body was female, she was Caucasian, and she had shoulder-length curly red hair. The coroner estimated her age to be between 17 and 25, but said there was an off chance she could be as old as 30. The unidentified woman was wearing jeans and a shirt, and she had been wrapped in a blanket. That blanket had seminal fluid on it. The woman had green eyes, and she was covered in freckles, as many redheads are. This victim had some expensive dental work done that initially the police hoped would help identify her. She had a partial denture with 2 false teeth, and she also had quite a few scars on her body. One of them was a fresh burn mark on her arm. Sadly, this victim was between 10 and 12 weeks pregnant when she had died. The police have never released an official cause of death for this victim. It's one of the details they're holding to this day. For months, and then years, and then decades, this victim went unidentified. No one reported her missing, and no one knew who she was. But in September of 2018, after rerunning her fingerprints through the more advanced system, the woman was finally named. She was Tina Marie McKinney Farmer, and she was from Indiana. She was 21 or 22 at the time of her murder. She had last been seen in Indianapolis, Indiana, with a trucker who was headed to Kentucky. Tina had a daughter and a family who missed her and did, in fact, report her missing. But as we so often see in these older cases, the police departments did not communicate, and no one in Indiana had entered Tina into the database in that state. So, Indiana, that one's on you. In these older cases, we often see these little tiny details that could make such a huge difference. Something as easy as someone misplacing a handwritten telephone message or not entering someone's name into a database. It ends up affecting people for years, for decades. Now, Tina's case is different than many of the cases we're going to talk about today, because unfortunately, not only was she one of many victims, her identification is a rare thing here. But she did go unidentified for many, many years, and the people that were missing her suffered all of that time when it could have been easier to identify her had someone just put her name as a missing person into the database like they should have. About 8 weeks later, on February 24th, 1985, in DeSoto County, Mississippi, again along the side of an interstate highway, a woman's body is found by a truck driver. She is wearing a pinkish shirt and jeans, and again, she has shoulder-length red hair. This time, the victim's shoes were missing. They were not found on her body, and they were not found at the dump site. Police theorized that the killer took them as a trophy. This victim had 2 tattoos. One of them had the initials THC, and the other said either REJ or RET. The coroner was able to determine that this victim had been strangled. There was a ligature present, and he also believed that she had been sexually assaulted. This woman was a heavy smoker, and police quite quickly linked her to the other victims. She was labeled the DeSoto County Jane Doe because, again, no one reported her missing and no one claimed to recognize her, which in and of itself is very sad. This case doesn't have a lot of great detail online, and you'll even find researchers who disagree with the number of victims. Some say this particular victim that we just talked about is not linked to this case. Others are emphatic that she is. But because there isn't a whole lot of detail, I had a difficult time nailing down the month and year that police began to really believe they had a serial killer on their hands. I found some theories, but nothing concrete. And I don't love to pass along other researchers' theories if I can help it. I like to make sure I'm getting my information from a news source or a court site. I couldn't really do that here. So I'm not sure as to when police made the decision that these victims were linked. And again, we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. Just 6 weeks later, on March 31st, 1985, skeletonized remains were found. There was a little bit of hair remaining on the bones, and again, it was red. This body was found on Interstate 24 in Cheatham County, Tennessee. The coroner determined the woman had been dead between 2 and 5 months. She was between 30 and 40 years old, and again, she was white. Investigators try for months, and then years, and then decades to identify this woman, but to this day, like so many women in this story, no one knows who she is. This is all going to start sounding like I'm on repeat, but again, several weeks later, April 1st, 1985, another body is found along Route 25 in Knox County, Kentucky. This time, the woman is not just out in the open on the road like the other bodies. Her body is in an old white Admiral brand refrigerator, this refrigerator right here. Can you imagine being the person that opened that fridge up and found a decomposing corpse? I don't think I can think of many things that are much more horrifying than that. The refrigerator was old. It dated clear back to the 1950s, which was old even in 1985, and there was a sticker on it that said Superwoman. The woman inside is nude except for green and yellow striped socks. She's between 20 and 30 years old, and again, she has been suffocated. She also has beautiful red hair, and she has been dead for only a few days. Some believe the woman was heard over a CB radio trying to find a ride to South Carolina. Sadly, this woman took decades to be identified, but it is said that over 500 people attended her funeral even when they didn't know her. Word was spreading about these victims, and people were starting to get really upset. Just 2 days later, on April 3rd, 1985, another body is found in Campbell County, Tennessee. It happens all over again, but with some differences. The body is not found just off the interstate like the other girls, and this victim is very young. She is estimated to be only 9 to 14 years old. Someone was out on a strip mine looking for rocks and found this poor little thing close to Big Wheel Gap Road. Only the skull and about 30 other bones remained of this victim. There was no way to determine her cause of death, and her hair was mostly gone. They're not 100% sure she was a redhead. Authorities do, however, decide to link this body to the string of murders that become known as the Redhead Murders. For a while, they were calling them the Bible Belt Murders because all of the victims were found along roads in the Bible Belt, but the official name for the case is the Redhead Murders, if you want to look it up. Not 2 weeks later, on April 14th, 1985, they find another body. So now we have a killer that is in a frenzy. Bodies are being found not only every month, but sometimes 2 in a month. As you well know, there are serial killers that only kill once every few years. So to have someone killing twice a month, it's terrifying, and it's difficult for the police who are trying to hurry and solve the case before there's another murder. This victim has strawberry blonde hair with red highlights, and she is found in Greene County, Tennessee. The victim has been stabbed and beaten to death. As you also well know, it is unusual for a serial killer to change their manner of murder, but it does happen, and so the police feel this victim is that of the killer, the same killer they've been hunting. This victim has been dead 3 to 6 weeks and was in a very advanced state of decomposition. Police were still able to obtain fingerprints, though, and at autopsy it was discovered that the woman had been pregnant before her murder, but had miscarried very shortly before she was killed. They don't know if she miscarried during the murder, which is something that makes me so sad, or if it was maybe a couple days prior. She was only estimated to be between 14 and 19 years old at the time of her death. And again, this murder goes unsolved for decades, but this one does have an update. I'm going to give you updates on each of the victims as soon as we finish talking about the timeline of circumstances. On April 20th, 1985, a redhead that is known only as the Pulaski County Jane Doe was found in Wrightsville, Arkansas. She was between 30 and 40 years old at the time of her murder, and that's about all we have on her. It's very sad. These women are just lost to time. No one claims them. No one knows who they are. It's like their lives didn't mean anything, and they did. Now, like I said, this case has not only less information than most, but a lot of the information online varies. I have 5 or 6 very reliable sources that I have found to be the most accurate in researching these true crime cases, and even those sites had varying information. So this is where I'm going to stop and kind of take a turn in the story. There are not only more victims, but more suspected victims, and that's what we're going to discuss now. But from here on out, you may find varying information online about whether or not these victims are officially linked to this set of murders. I just like to be totally transparent about these kinds of things so that, one, you know you can trust me when I give you information, and when I tell you I don't know with certainty, I tell you that I don't know with certainty. And 2, when and if these cases are ever solved, I don't want to be someone who contributed to misinformation being online. So I just like to be very clear whenever there is ambiguity or vagueness and tell you there is varying information out there. The next murders I'm going to tell you about, it kind of depends on who you ask. Most authorities consider these women to be suspected victims of the same killer, but they have not been definitively tied to the other murders. There are many similarities, though. On August 29th, 1987, in Roane County, Tennessee, we get the same thing. A redheaded woman was found murdered. Now, this woman had breast implants, so I'm a little bit confused as to why she could not be identified because, as I'm sure many of you know, breast implants have serial numbers, and they're very easily traced back to the doctor who implanted them, a doctor that would have that patient's records. So again, I don't have an answer for that. It's very well known that all breast implants have a serial number on them and should be able to be easily tracked. The next victim is not found until 1988, so that's a very long gap in time. There are those that say this murder should not be included in this set of killings. But on December 16th, in Rising Fawn, Alabama, another white, red-headed woman is found dead. She's wearing jeans and a blue sweater. She's got 2 pieces of jewelry on that have hearts on them. Police believe this woman to be a runaway or a hitchhiker. She was young, late 20s at the very oldest, and she has been strangled and sexually assaulted. The very last possible victim in this string of murders was discovered on May 7th, 1990 in Rogers, Arkansas, just off Highway 102. This poor woman was mostly bones. She had not only been murdered, but she had been set on fire and then run over, something authorities hadn't seen in any of the other murders. So again, they weren't sure as to whether or not this victim was related to the others. Now, before I continue to tell you details about the investigation, I want to tell you which of the victims have been identified. I think it's important to name our victims and put their faces with their names. Not all of the women I've talked about today have been identified, but we know who some of them are now. It took decades and more recent technology to discover who these poor women were in this life, so I'm just going to go through the victims chronologically. The very first victim, Wetzel County Jane Doe, has never been identified. The second victim, September of 1984, remember, was identified a year later as Lisa Nichols. The third victim, New Year's Day, 1985, was Tina Farmer. That could have been identified much sooner than 2018 had the Indiana police just put her in the database. DeSoto County Jane Doe, we still don't know who she is. Cheatham County Jane Doe, we don't know who she is either. April of 1985, the Knox County Jane Doe, the woman who was found in the refrigerator, she was finally identified in October of 2018. She was Epsie Pilgrim. Epsie was the mother to 5 children, and her DNA was matched with one of her daughters in one of the databases. So thankfully, at least those kids know what happened to their mom. It's awful to have to wait all of those years just to find out she's been dead, and she died a terrible way. Now, the girl that was found on Big Wheel Gap Road, she was identified in August of last year. This poor girl was only 15 years old, and her name was Tracy Sue Walker. She was from Lafayette, Indiana. Tracy would run away from the group home she was in from time to time, and she was last seen alive at the Tippecanoe Mall in 1978. Now, she wasn't found until 1985. Yes, she was just bones when they found her, but for how long was this poor girl kept alive before her murder? What did she endure? I try not to think about those things because it just makes it harder to research these cases, but we will never know if this young girl was kept and then, killed immediately, or she was kept for a long amount of time, endured a lot of torture, was killed a year before she was found. It's hard to tell when they're just bones, apparently. I'm not an expert on that, but from everything I've read. Greene County Doe, she was identified in 2018. She was Elizabeth Lamotte, and she was only 17. At the time of her death, she had been missing for about a year. For a while, they thought that Elizabeth had been taken by Terry Rasmussen and might be one of the girls in the barrels in Bear Brook. If you haven't seen that episode, it is a fascinating story. This is the thumbnail for part 1. This is the thumbnail for part 2. You'll want to watch part 1 first, obviously, about the Bear Brook barrels. And then in part 2, we talk about the killer that they didn't know they were chasing until later on. It's a really fascinating story. But yeah, they thought Elizabeth might be one of those victims, and she was not, but sadly, the same end. Pulaski County Jane Doe and Roane County Jane Doe are still unidentified. The victim found in Rising Fawn, Arkansas, the woman found in 1988, has been identified as Stacy Lynn Chahorski. Stacy had been missing for about a year, and just a few months ago, not only was Stacy identified, but so was her killer. She is not part of the Redhead Murders. Her killer was Henry Frederick Wise, who also went by Hoss Wise. He was a trucker with a long criminal history. The last victim, well, possible victim, depending on who you talk to, has also been identified. She was Donna Sue Nelson, again murdered in 1990. For a long time, police believed her boyfriend killed her. Her boyfriend was a man named George Alvin Bruton, who also committed crimes right here in Utah, and many still believe him to be her killer. It's really fascinating how we are able to identify victims now, isn't it? And I'm happy for the families that these women now have names to go with their stories. But who is their killer? Now, as if this wasn't already all convoluted enough, well, it ain't going to get any less convoluted. I'll just say that. Let's talk about who most police believe to be the redheaded killer. You didn't think this was solved, did you? I hope not. I hope you weren't waiting for me to tell you who this killer is, because now you're mad at me. This is Jerry Leon Johns. He was a truck driver and he was a violent man. Jerry Leon Johns died in prison in 2015 when he was only 67 years old. So here's what we know about Jerry. Clear back in 1985, he was suspected of the first slayings. He was 37 years old back then, and there was a lot of reason to suspect he was the serial killer. Back in 1985, Jerry Leon Johns kidnapped a woman, assaulted her, and left her on the side of the road, alive but injured. Now, Jerry didn't know she was still alive. He thought she was dead. This woman had red hair. So, of course, authorities bring him in, and for over a year, he was considered the only suspect. Cops were just trying to put a case together on him, trying to get all of the details. But like so many of the details in this case, this too is lost. For some reason, a reason I could not find, in 1987, Jerry Leon Johns was cleared in the Redhead Murders and was no longer considered involved. But then, in 2016, the semen on Tina Farmer's clothing was tested, and it did belong to Jerry Leon Johns. He was Tina's killer. The problem is that back then, they didn't do a great job testing for DNA, and Tina is one of the few that any examples exist for. Now, I told you that in 1985, authorities knew that Jerry had kidnapped a woman. He met her here at this strip club called Catch One. He talked the woman into going back to his hotel room with him, and when they got there, Jerry took out two $100 bills and tore them in half. He gave the woman one half of each of the bills and told her she'd get the rest later on. But something went wrong in the motel room, and Jerry ended up strangling the woman almost to death. He then dumped her on the side of the road, thinking she was dead. I really wish we knew why Jerry was then ruled out on the rest of these murders. Unfortunately, by the time he was connected to Tina's murder, he was dead. But they brought this woman in that he thought he had killed and hadn't, and she gave them a description. A lot of these details are very hazy and again depend on what site you look at. Authorities and family members didn't even get the satisfaction of telling Jerry they knew what he had done to Tina. Agents who worked on this case remember Jerry Leon Johns as a very arrogant man. He was intelligent and he liked to read. He was crafty and he was manipulative. Lots of characteristics of a psychopath here, right? And he also prided himself on irritating the cops. He loved knowing that they didn't have enough on him to arrest him. Later on, there was another suspect, a 32-year-old trucker from Pennsylvania, but he was ruled out by his trucking logs. And my friends, this is where we're at. The last interview I found on this case was dated about 9 months ago. There are still police working on this case. At one point in the 1980s, there was a task force. The media called it the Redhead Task Force, but it's long since been disbanded. The cold case detectives still assigned to this case, one of them is this officer here, they say that they wish they had more information on possible suspects. They wish they had more DNA to test, more DNA that was found on other victims, but they just don't. For now, we are left to wonder not only who the killer is, but whether or not some or all of these victims are really linked. This is one of those stories that really does have as many questions as it does answers. Usually there are more theories, there are more suspects and more clues. But here, there is just very little to go on. What I'm really hoping is that this episode becomes a part 1. What I'm really hoping for is that in the next year or two, I can bring you an update. I can tell you that there has been a break in the case. I can tell you that more family members have some answers. But for now, I can't do any of those things. All we can do is keep the faces and the known names of the victims alive by talking about them and by remembering them and by hoping that one day in the future, we will have a face and a name for the monster who took all they had so many years ago. Thank you so much for joining me today on Dining with Death True Crime Tuesday. Please hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to support me. The other thing you can do to support the community and the channel is join Patreon. If you can only donate $1 or $2 a month, that's great with me. It helps support the channel, and in the end, we have a goal there. We want to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money to test it. We want to get that DNA tested so it helps to close the case it's associated with, but also so that it gets that perpetrator's DNA in the system in the event that that perpetrator is linked to other crimes. With a monetary donation, you can help us reach that goal, and we are going to be doing some fundraising. I sure appreciate you spending a little bit of your day with me. Your support, it's the only reason I'm still doing this at this point. I'm 3 years into this, and the growth has been a little bit slow, but your comments telling me how much you enjoy the content and telling me you don't understand why the channel isn't bigger, honestly, that's why I'm still here. So thank you. And stay safe, my friends. Be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.